welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Tuesday, October 26th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, so here are the news stories for the day from the Associated Press and other news sources. Federal and tribal officials say a new law aimed at combating crime on reservations will help them address domestic violence, rape, and other violent crimes that have ravaged Indian women at rates much higher than the national average. About 150 judges, tribal leaders, and law enforcement officials were in Albuquerque, New Mexico last week for a national symposium on implementing the Tribal Law and Order Act signed by President Obama in July. The law requires officers serving Indian country to be trained in collecting evidence and interviewing sexual assault victims. It also requires the Indian Health Service to establish a nationwide protocol for helping victims of sexual assault. A federal judge has ruled that Benson County, North Dakota must open 2 polling sites on a reservation for the November 2nd elections, though the judge says the county's decision to close them wasn't tied to racial discrimination. Judge Ralph Erickson said in his ruling dated last Thursday that sites in Fort Totten and Warwick will be open to voters, though a third contested site in Oberon is off the Spirit Lake Reservation and will remain closed. The county decided to have only 1 polling site in the county seat of Minnewacan to save money, a move that complies with state law. The tribe took the case to court, arguing the decision would hurt Indian voting and continue a history of official racial discrimination in voting processes there. And today we go to Shoshone Bannock tribal member Mark Trahant, fresh back from Alaska, to talk a little bit about the politics of politics and the upcoming midterm election scheduled on November 2nd. And just a quick reminder, early voting is now open all across the country. If you're handicapped, shy, elderly, don't like getting in a line, now is the time to get to the polls and get it out of the way. And anybody registered to vote or registering to vote is able to vote early. Here we go to Mark.
Mark Trahant, you just came back from Alaska, where politics at the Senate level race seems to be remarkably interesting, because the person who might be now in the lead or very close to it isn't even on the ballot.
Right.
What can you tell me about your trip to Alaska? And let's get into the political thing after we find out what you've been looking at.
Well, the main reason I was up there is I'm working on a story for a TV show Frontline, and we can talk about that down the road. But let's just talk about politics now. The Lisa Murkowski, who's the current senator, is working as if she was Indian country's best friend forever, and particularly Alaska Native.
Yeah, and a Republican. Okay,
right.
So let's start out with that. So let's.
And in fairness, she's been good on many issues. She was one of the sponsors of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And she does play a role. It's not like this is a new thing to her. That said, she sees her chance for getting back. She lost the primary to a conservative Republican Tea Party person. And she sees her way back in as the Alaska Native vote. And the Alaska Federation of Natives, she went to the convention, gave a very long, detailed speech about everything she's doing in Indian country. And then, and I think this is pretty remarkable, was able to get the AFN floor by acclamation to support her bid for a write-in vote. They were doing all sorts of things. Some of my favorites were picking up people and taking them to the Secretary of State's office for early voting right from the convention floor. They were using their hands, getting her name on outside of the hand to show people how to spell her name right. They had cards they were passing out that went through the process of a write-in candidacy. The amount of organization was pretty incredible. And what's interesting is if you look at voting patterns in Alaska, the Native voting pattern is bigger than either the conservative Republican group or the Democratic group. And so if she's able to get some people from the middle plus the Native villages, she stands a very good chance of winning re-election.
Right now, it looks poll-wise that's a possibility. The Democratic candidate is running about 20-something percent, and the two are split between Joe Miller, the Tea Party Palin endorsed candidate who had a reporter handcuffed. His security crew handcuffed a reporter not too long. Got all kinds of controversies going on. The Murkowski family has a long history of delivering for Alaska, so it makes interesting sense that AFN would endorse her.
Oh, sure.
My understanding is the population base is about 18 to 20%, and that kind of a vote, if it turns out, can carry the balance of power.
Right. And the way they're trying to do turnout is early voting, to get people to go to the poll and take care of it while they're thinking about it. I should say something about the Democrat, because he's not giving up.
Right.
He's been very strident on sovereignty issues and says he's with the native villages. And in terms of many of them are incorporated under the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act as governments, and he wants to give them more, particularly judicial power. He promised to shake 5,000 hands at AFN and was going to stay there until that was done. He also had some very interesting advertising. He had a booth where invited delegates to come have their picture taken with him, which does two things. One, it gets them engaged personally, but also it gets their name and phone number in his database.
Right.
And so they've been working hard on that as well. The thing the Democrats have going for them in Alaska is at the ticket for governor, there's a native woman who's the candidate for lieutenant governor, and she was all over the place at AFN and very visible and outrounding of
Diane Benson. Now, in Alaska, do you have just a general ballot so people can go down and back and forth, right?
Right.
Okay.
She is linked to the governor candidate, though. Those two you
absolutely, yeah, that's right. They run as a team in Alaska. In some states they don't. You can actually elect a lieutenant governor that's not a team. It can be an independent. Literally, in some places, my understanding is you could get a Republican lieutenant governor and a Democratic governor, or the other way around. So,
and she has demonstrated her ability to wrap up the Native community. She had about 3/4 of the votes in the primary. I mean, she was very strong going into this race.
It's interesting. Sometimes politics is simple as getting a pledge for someone to contribute $1 to your campaign because it invests them. The pitcher thing, or those kinds of tactics where you personalize that vote, rather than the attack ads, where nowadays we don't even know who's funding them because of the Supreme Court decision, and the U.S. Congress is pushing millions of dollars of secret money into the campaigns, mainly on the Republican tickets. We don't even know who is fighting who.
I'll tell you another reason why that dollar is important is it gets their cell phone number. Once you have that cell phone number, you can start sending texts. And even in some of the most remote native villages, people are using text technology.
Well, and let me ask this question. I was looking at something from Pew Research that says there was a cell phone gap in most typical polls. And most typical polls nowadays are saying the Republicans are winning the country. And yet the Pew Research Center is saying there is a cell phone gap that's grown from about 2% to about 6% in the polling because of the lack of landlines.
Right. And I'm in that group. I no longer have a landline. And my cell phone doesn't even have an Idaho area code. So I'm definitely in that group of folks that have gone a different route from tradition.
Well, that would be an interesting factor. We'll have to see where it is. Arizona, we have a state secretary running. A lot of people were watching what was going to happen on November 2nd with the Navajo presidential race, which had a certain interesting curveball thrown on Friday with the warrants and indictments against both Ben Shelley and his running mate for fraud out of that impoverished discretionary fund that they had their fingertips in. In Oklahoma, do we know about the candidates down there? We have more Native candidates than ever before running.
Right. I think across the country we have some very interesting races with Native candidates, both in districts where there are not a lot of Natives, like Claudia Kaufman in Washington, and races like in Arizona with the Secretary of State that brings out the same Navajo voter pool. So it could be a very interesting day on November 2nd. And like you said, none of this shows up in the polls.
Right. Tell me a little bit more about the Claudia Kaufman. She was just elected, so she's trying to get her second term there, isn't she?
Right. And she was the #1 target of the Republican Party in the state. She's in a swing district. It's a very tough district for her. She won it pretty handily last time, but it's a tough climb this time. A lot will depend on turnout and whether she's able to get her voters out.
A new poll published, at least I read it in the New York Times yesterday, says that Obama favorability rate has gone from something like 44% up to 54 or 55% since he hit the road and began explaining the fact that there was a $400 per person tax cut last year that most people don't remember because they didn't get it in a check. It was
Right.
it was in the tables. And those kinds of things. Simply getting out and explaining his agenda and explaining some of his own frustration. Is it a matter of voter turnout that's going to make the big difference this year?
In an off-year election, I think it's all about turnout and whether you can get people to the polls. And I think early voting helps in some respect, but I also think some of the traditional. I mean, one thing Obama did so well last time that I think they will be doing again is collecting cell phone numbers. And on election day, reminding people, have you gone out? Have you actually done the deed? And that's what remains to be seen because, again, that does not show up in polling.
Cell phone collections in early voting. Early voting is open just in all those states that have it, is my understanding.
Right.
Wisconsin now is early voting. That means what? That you can take grandma down there and people who are handicapped, they don't have to stand in line. They should be able to cast their
Right.
vote early and get it out of the way. Do you see more people participating in the election process because of that?
Oh, sure. I mean, some states like Washington, it's virtually entire vote by mail now. So Oregon entirely vote by mail. So you have states that have gone that route. Idaho has early voting. A lot of people I know have already voted. And the great thing for campaigns is they can start collecting that data and know what they need on election day because they know who's already voted.
Okay, Mark, thanks for your update on it. We're going to keep track of this until next week. I hope to do a little bit of maybe some live feed or some reports on November 2nd with the results. We want to watch Claudia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Alaska, see if we get a tea party up there. What's happening?
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining with us again. Take care.
Okay.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Me, Gwetch, for stopping by. Come back again soon.